Bienvenidas, bienvenidos, bienvenides a una oportunidad más de interactuar con grandes pensadores en este programa Pensadores Contemporáneos. Hoy tenemos la fortuna de que nos visite en México la doctora Vivienne Ming, neurocientífica, emprendedora y ejemplo de vida, pero qué mejor que dejar que ella misma nos explique, nos cuente quién es, cómo llegó aquí y qué es lo que hace. Dr. Vivienne, thank you very much for being here.
Lovely to be here.
First of all, could you tell us what is like the main activity that you do? But before that, what is the pathway that leads you to be who you are right now, contributing to society?
Well, the pathway and what I do are so intertwined. But so talking about one, I kind of have to talk about the other. Maybe I'll start with this. When I was very young, my parents told me I would win a Nobel Prize. I grew up in a little valley that John Steinbeck wrote a book about, and it's called The Pastures of Heaven. So according to a Nobel Prize winner, I grew up in the pastures of heaven of California, and I would win a Nobel Prize. And by the time I was even very young, I was thinking, I don't know who they think I am, but I'm not going to win this prize. I'm not as smart as everyone keeps thinking that I am. And I gave up on my life. And
how old were you when you felt like that?
Oh, 11,
Wow.
12. I was a clever kid. I did very well on standard exams. So even though I was a terrible student, I was admitted to universities, University of California, these wonderful schools. But then when I was on my own, I truly gave up and I ended up homeless.
Wow.
Which is an experience I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. It was this terrible period where I didn't know where my next meal was coming from. And I thought that I had betrayed the world because I was supposed to be this amazing person, and I wasn't. And I finally came to a realization that maybe I would never be happy. Turned out I was wrong about that. But maybe that would be true, but that didn't have to be the reason that I was alive. It didn't have to be the reason I could work at something. I didn't have to be the smartest person.
Yeah.
I didn't have to be the happiest person. I could just live a life that made other people's lives better. At least that's what I told myself. So it took many years, but I had the chance to go back to university. And this part's a little funny. What I wanted to do was build a better person.
Yourself.
Myself, but
also
if
others.
I was trying to build a better person for myself, is there something I could do in education, in neuroscience? Is there something I could do in economics? Anything that could help other people as well. So since I had all of these fields, I went back to my university and I flipped a coin, and it came up heads. So I decided to be a neuroscientist. I just loved the idea of understanding the brain and the big mystery behind it. Why am I the way I am, and everyone else also? And so I thought, that I might be an electrophysiologist, which means I stick wires into cats and record the activity of cells, or an anatomist, or any of these many, many fields in neuroscience. And then, totally unexpected, I was asked to be a research assistant in a lab called the Machine Perception Lab, where they were using artificial intelligence to understand the brain and studying the brain to come up with better artificial intelligence, a field called theoretical neuroscience. And I had always been a science fiction fan my entire life. And when I was introduced to this field, that was it. I get to make fake brains on computers and teach them how to do things. At the time, I didn't even, of course, who could have predicted how big artificial intelligence would become?
So in which year are we talking about?
1999. So I returned to university in 1999, and I built my first ever artificial intelligence model. In many parts of the world, this story should be taken just as it is. That lab had received $5 million from the CIA to do facial analysis to tell if people were lying or not. We can all guess what the CIA might want to do with that. But for us, just doing research. My undergraduate honors thesis was a neural network, a kind of an artificial intelligence, that could find your philtrum and your pupils, and then locate your face and tell whether you were smiling or not. It was a machine doing something that felt so human. And while we were working on that, I also got to work on a project to analyze the facial expressions of children in classrooms to tell if they were actually learning and engaged with what they were doing. So I got these two things, this love of science. You get to learn a secret no one else in the world knows, and then tell a story about it to the rest of the world. But also, maybe even more so, this love of taking science and building something that helps someone. A young child that's learning, or as a graduate student, I developed one of the first models that could actually learn how it learned to hear on its own. And what it learned looked just like what our ears do. But again, we got to take that algorithm and build it into a cochlear implant, an electronic device. It wires into your brain, your 8th cranial nerve, and it restores hearing to the deaf. And when it had our AI in it, it worked even better than it did without it. Maybe the first time ever that a human brain and an artificial brain had actually been literally directly wired together. And people could hear, they couldn't hear before. And again, it's addictive. When you have the chance to build something that changes someone's life. By good fortune, doing this also changed my life. But it just changes how you see the world. And so now I have companies that I found, and I have scientific research that I do. But what I really do is I run a philanthropic lab. People bring me challenging problems. Dr. Ming, my daughter has 500 seizures a day. Please save her life. Or my son can't enter REM sleep, but he's still alive. Like it really sounds like science fiction, but it isn't just neuroscience. Dr. Ming, our country does everything the World Bank tells us to do. Our PISA, our international education test scores go up every year, but still no one wants to hire our citizens. Help figure out what's going wrong. Our company has bias in its promotion process. Help us build an economic model so we can change how we hire. If I think my team and I can make a meaningful difference, if there's something people don't understand about this problem, then I'll pay for everything, and whatever we invent, we give away. And that's what I love doing. So that's my very messy
No, that's
story.
very, very interesting. So I think I could summarize what you just said. Like the last part is that, like the key was to allow to grow your endogenous motivation instead of the, I don't know how to call it, like the outside, the social, the exogenous stimuli to do what they expect.
And so
is
it
what,
turns
what
out
you want to do.
Yeah.
It's for yourself, and then everything comes.
And I got to give actually a TED Talk with that very phrase, endogenous motivation,
I see.
In it. The title of the talk is The Paradox of Incentive Insensitivity. But essentially, one of my companies, we built a database of 122 million people. We were using artificial intelligence to place people in the right job.
Okay.
And so, well, to do that, then I needed to understand what makes people great at their jobs. And we saw this really interesting thing. Salespeople, the most incentivized job in the world. You get a bigger bonus if you sell more things. So surely salespeople care about everything that comes in outside, exogenous motivation. They care about the incentives. They care about the extrinsic rewards. It turns out you get a little clever, and you figure out a way of measuring that moment when all the incentives disappear. And the salespeople are just doing it for themselves. It turns out the best salespeople sell the most stuff.
Without the bonus,
without the incentives. It turns out they do get the biggest bonuses because they're the best salespeople, but it's a correlation, not a cause. And so what we discovered was, paradoxically, the people that got the biggest bonuses cared the least about them. And then we went and looked at little kids, and we found that the kids that cared the least about the praise from their teacher or a candy reward did better in class. And military officers that were doing it for themselves instead of a family legacy had much better career outcomes in the military across the board. So we got to look at all these different kinds of people.
So across the board, so it's not just like they say, like the American culture or the
So we
European,
found
is in different
in our
countries,
data set of 122 million people, we were looking people all over the world. There are very subtle differences in what we call collectivist cultures. So in China, there's a different relationship, but interestingly, it still plays out that the people that have the most exceptional outcomes, they're aware of the social signals, but they don't make their choices solely based on them, even in China. So yes, America can be a little weird in that respect, or a little extreme in being very individualist, but it turned out there's a difference between finding a sense of purpose and meaning in your life to make your decisions and just being selfish. There's a big difference. In fact, when I have a book I'm writing called Small Sacrifices, specifically about the psychological construct of purpose and my research regarding it. And what's interesting to me is two things. One is that the best behavioral measure we found of purpose is people who make sacrifices. It's the reason for the title of the book.
Like which kind of sacrifices?
So at work, we got to look at thousands, tens of thousands of people in a big multinational company. So the employees are from all over the world. And this giant company wanted to know what's the biggest driver of productivity inside our company that we're not looking at. And so they allowed me to go in and be a mad scientist and measure. This is before COVID. We were doing contact tracing, looking at when people interact and talk to each other in real time. And then for some of them, they volunteered to wear recorders so we could see what they talked about. And we would find these people that would wander through their day, and they'd meet someone, and they'd meet someone, and then a third person. And every time they met them, those people they met with, everything they were working on got better. even though that first person didn't have any reason to care or benefit directly from it. And then when we looked at the conversations and recordings, what we found is they just helped other people, even when it didn't benefit them. And it was the single biggest driver of what was going on inside the company, with these not tiny number, but small number of people that just helped other people. And here's another paradox. So in classic economic theory, you should be rationally self-interested. You should do things for yourself and let everything work out. These people were not being rationally self-interested. They were helping other people even when it cost them. But they lived longer. They had more friends. They earned more money. Even though in the moment they made sacrifices, they lead better lives. And so for me, as we began our conversation, trying to understand, how do you make a better person? That idea that part of it is that those people need to have a meaning in their life. For some, it could be spiritual. For others, it could be very grounded and human. But when people have something bigger than themselves, something that's going to take more than a lifetime to complete, they end up having better insulin sensitivity, lower central body mass, lower all-cause mortality. But, you know, if you're a young person listening to me right now, they earn more money, they have more friends, and they go further in their education. It seems, again, not like you should be antagonistic to your professors and your teachers, but at the same time, you need to work hard in the class because you want to achieve something, not because you want to get a good grade,
Exactly.
not because you want to make your professor or your parents happy. And that's a very complex idea. And maybe one of the best pieces of evidence I have to support that doesn't come, unfortunately, from my research, but Raj Chetty, the economist at Harvard, one of his least known pieces of research found that some teachers made a huge outsized contribution to the long-term life outcomes of their students. So decades later, their students were earning more, they'd be more likely to go to university, they had better lives. And interestingly, this small number of teachers, if you actually looked at their students' test scores the next year, they actually did slightly worse. They had better lives, even as their exams weren't quite as good as they could have been. Surely we care about the lives and not the exams. And so that's what a lot of my life has been about, whether it's education and economics, or my companies are studying Alzheimer's and postpartum depression using epigenetics and neurosynchronization. Some of this is very technical, some of it is very human, but it's all about better people.
So now to understand how can you contribute to improve this human life, personal and the society, using AI, could you explain us what it is, artificial intelligence, and then how do you apply it to neuroscience to get this?
At its simplest level, that kind of captures AI even as we would have talked about it 60 years ago. Wow, 80 years ago. Artificial intelligence is any autonomous system that can make a decision under uncertainty. So if there's no uncertainty, if it's just if this, then that, today we might call that robotic process automation. So when you fill out a form online and it fills in other things elsewhere, that's not AI. That's just a simple robotic algorithm that's carrying that out. AI is a decision under uncertainty. How fast should this car be going when I make a left turn on a rainy night? I'm reading a resume from a job applicant. Should this person get forwarded to a hiring manager to decide whether to bring them in for an interview? Neither of those have absolutely right or wrong answers, but they certainly have better or worse answers. And, you know, for most of human history, we were the only ones that could make judgments like that. And since the 60s, we haven't been alone, but back then it was very simple. It wasn't much beyond an if-then statement, but it could do interesting things. The original AIs back in the 60s could solve math problems, could play chess, which that's what very smart people do. So therefore AI must be very smart. And it took a long time for us to understand that much of intelligence happens in ways that we're not aware of. Much of intelligence isn't explicitly remembering and working through the logic of a problem. It's simply recognizing your face and remembering whether we'd met before or not. It is knowing how to change the way you speak when you're with different people. These are very subtle things that don't have rules associated with them. So not originally, but most famously in the 1980s, we come up with something called neural networks. Mm-hmm. These are big, complicated mathematical programs that are inspired by our own brains. And in fact, my own field of theoretical neuroscience came into existence because people started to want to say, maybe we could understand real brains by making massive neural networks and teaching them how to do things. What my research was about. Mm-hmm. So again, it was pure science when I was doing this in 1999 and 2000 until I published my dissertation in 2006.
It was for your PhD?
For my PhD, yeah. But then by 2006, this new idea had entered, the deep neural network. And it was a system that could recognize faces and images better than people could. It really was just a neural network, but made bigger and bigger and bigger with more and more data trained.
So that is the trick, to train with data. What made the difference? How cool we as a humanity
when we go from artificial intelligence to a big change, what's called machine learning.
What it is?
And machine learning is essentially, at its heart, it's essentially statistics. But for practical purposes, I said my undergraduate honors thesis was a neural network that learned how to find faces and recognize a real smile. I didn't program it to recognize a real smile. I had a bunch of pictures of people that were genuinely smiling and a bunch of pictures of people that were fake smiling. And I showed the network over and over again, real smile, fake smile, real smile, fake smile, again and again and again. I showed it, this is a pupil and this is a philtrum, again and again and again. And mathematically, I corrected it when it was wrong. And
that is what you mean when you said that it is all statistics.
In that sense, what it's learning, we take all those pictures I just described and we turn them into numbers. And so at its heart, even still today, we can talk about GPT, large language models. We can talk about generative image models, DALL-E, and all of these others that can make amazing lifelike pictures. All of this new AI that exists in the world, at its heart, we show it. We take lots of examples of the thing we are interested in. We turn those examples into numbers. Mm-hmm. And then we run mathematical algorithms over those numbers again and again and again. In the case of GPT-4, the upcoming release, we're talking about potentially trillions of individual calculations inside the model. Trillions of individual math equations constantly changing in response to being exposed to all of the images and all of the text and all of the voice recordings that, in this case, OpenAI could get their hands on, which is
everything.
The majority
Everybody wants
of them
to do
in the
it
world.
all the time. So.
And so sometimes these systems, not sometimes, let me be clear, always they're biased because we're biased. Mm-hmm. It's learned from how we perceive faces. It's learned from the language we
exactly,
wrote. Because
as your example of your undergrad thesis, you told the machine, this is real, this is fake. So, but that is your own bias.
So that's my own bias. And of course, if I show it a bunch of faces, and let's say most of them have lighter skin,
Excellent.
then it's not very good at seeing people with darker skin, which is still a problem today. And if I give it all of the language used in America, it's sexist, and it's racist, and it's all of these qualities. But to be clear, it isn't because AI is, it's because we are. And it's learning from us. And in that sense, as a scientist, I think it's fascinating because it shows us, it becomes a mirror where I can look at our own biases and try and understand ourselves better. I would never let an AI write for me, but using it to help me write better, using it to make me a better person, that's what I'm excited about. It's why I use it in education, in the systems that we build. It's why I use it in neuroscience. It's truly one of the most powerful tools ever invented. But I think the mistake is wanting to use it to make our life easier.
Yeah, because then we stop using our own capabilities, like the navigator, like choosing even the food that we will have, for example. So, yeah. So now, could you explain us, now that we understand what is AI, thank you very much, it was very clear how it is built. How can you apply it to improve, for example, education? So, like you were mentioning, like the face recognition of the kids paying attention. I remember a work in which they would put these electrodes to read the activity in the brains, EEG, and to record and they could tell that when there was a synchronization in the brain between the teacher and the students, that will be a better learning experience. Can artificial intelligence help to understand when is a successful education process and how can we foster it or something like that?
So interesting enough, I'm going to start with what AI, how it can actually make education worse. One, and this has been well shown over years, if it ever gives students the answer, then students never learn. And that's important to know because modern AI, particularly these large language models, you can talk to them. Now, both GPT and Google have versions you can literally talk to in real time on your phone, and it can answer all of your questions, which feels wonderful. All of the world's knowledge in your pocket, almost for free. But what we're amazing at, not is answering the questions from history. We're uniquely good at exploring the unknown. And unfortunately, if you just give a student an AI and it always gives them the answers, they stop exploring. And that robs all of their future potential from them. So the kind of AI that I find exciting and I build in my own work is AI that's actually meant to challenge the student. We're looking at where a student might have a misconcept. And the goal of the AI is to help the student discover that misconcept themselves, not just the answer, the truth of the misconcept, but for them to realize themselves that they have a misconcept. What's called active versus passive learning. Students don't like active learning because it exposes what you don't know, but you learn so much better.
But how can it be? For example, for me, it's very easy to imagine or to understand because it's what we see every day, just exactly the negative use of for example, of ChatGPT, or that you ask a question and you have the response immediately. But how do you use it in the sense that you are?
So we do a couple of things. One, I sort of described how I use it. So one is by making, what's neat about them is you can have them play different roles. So one could be a role model. So you have an AI, it's still not giving people answers, but students can interact with it. It's role modeling the behavior you want the student to pick up on. Okay. So it turns out the university you attend, the specific routine things you know how to do, what most of education historically has been the focus of. Well, again, we all have a machine in our pocket that can do it nearly for free, if not fully better than we can yet, so much faster that the cost just doesn't compare.
Yeah.
So what I'm really interested in is fostering the deeper qualities that are bigger predictors of long-term outcomes for students. Are you resilient? So if you got the wrong answer, do you keep trying? Are you a lateral thinker? You tried an answer, it didn't work. Do you then try exploring other ways of solving this? Maybe even ways that your parents or your professors hadn't brought up to you. And we see again and again in students that do better in school by actually using AIs to analyze their conversations. We can see the students that do the best willingly make mistakes. They willingly expose when they have a misconcept. They'll explore laterally. They are resilient when they make an error and they come back and try again. And another area is they're better at understanding other people. No student has all of these things mastered, but better students tend to have more of them. That's much more meaningful than the fact that they got top scores on tests. In fact, these are probably the reasons why they get better scores on tests. And so building AIs to foster resilience. Turns out the only way to help a student become resilient, they have to experience failure. And that can be very difficult to do in front of a class of your peers with a professor in the room. But in the quiet of just interacting with a robot, being wrong doesn't feel as costly, especially if the robot is supportive. And so some of the things we can build are these machines that help students move towards feeling safe in exploring ideas themselves. The machine is better at the routine knowledge. For now, we are better at creativity and exploration and uncertainty. And we really need to foster that in students. And it may seem funny, but we've had a lot of success using those very routine machines to help create circumstances where students feel safe to explore and where they can actually make progress in that space. But we also look at building new kinds of exams. Rather than a final summative exam at the end of the class that is very high stakes, we're working on building AIs that observe the student while they're learning. It looks at the artifacts they're creating, their conversations that they're having, and slowly builds a model of what the student is genuinely good at, which can be used to guide further education.
So that will be a guide for the teachers, for example?
It can be a guide for the student, for the teachers, for the parents. Interestingly enough, my wife is used to run research for the San Francisco school system, which is a challenging job. But now she works for the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, who about 120 years ago came up with the idea of the Carnegie Unit, the 4-unit course that most universities and schools, high schools, secondary schools use still today. Turns out the Carnegie Foundation wants to end that. And it is my wife's project, and she and I get to talk about this in detail. How can we use artificial intelligence so as a student grows, in real time, we update our formal model of them. And as soon as they know how to do something, then they're done with it. They don't have to keep going in that class, they can move on to other work. And again, this would be incredibly challenging to do in a traditional education environment. But using artificial intelligence to create, for example, for a professor, a dashboard so they can see where all of their individual students are at in real time, not just in terms of their mastery of the material, but again, those more complex qualities of emotional intelligence and social skills and raw cognitive ability that influence all of these outcomes. And frankly, no one asked us to teach students how to do that before. But certainly when I'm deciding which of my undergraduate students might someday be my graduate students, that's a lot of how I make my decisions. They all know the stuff I taught them in class. It's the ones that are resilient and creative and adaptive that end up joining my lab. Why aren't we teaching that? When that's the one thing ChatGPT cannot do. Instead, we still treat students like they're just another kind of AI. We give them lots of examples and we tell them when they're right or wrong.
Yeah. And are you developing some AI who's just for what you just said, like to foster socio-emotional skills? Because I agree with you. Like in the students in the classroom, they need to develop both, not just the academia, not just the curricula, but to live a better life themselves and in the society. We need to learn how to. Are there tools already out there to foster?
Yeah, there are many groups working hard on this problem, and I've had the chance to build some myself. So we built a system called Muse. Unfortunately, for now, it's only in English, but we're genuinely working. Spanish is next. And it's for new parents.
Muse is Muse like the Muse?
M-U-S-E.
Like you give me the inspiration?
Like inspiration.
Okay.
But what's interesting is it's a Muse for the parent, not for the child. So
Nor the teacher.
the
for the
AI
parents.
learns about your family. Whatever you want to share, and only what you want to share, it learns about you. And then every night, it generates an activity for you to do with your children.
So you tell this device or what, like your daily life, like in your home, or what do you mean?
It asks you questions, although that was the original version. The modern version has a large language model in it, so you can actually just talk to it.
I see.
And so it will ask you things. Do you text while driving? Turns out that's our number one question that nobody wants to answer.
Every question is voluntary. I mean, you answer as long.
Every question is entirely voluntary. You only share what you want to share. All of this is now run through my nonprofit called the Human Trust. My claim is, just as I have a right to a doctor or a lawyer working only in my interest, we around the world must have the right to AI acting solely in our interest. Not about bias. Bias is inescapable. But if I'm interacting with a system that's meant to help my child, or is giving me a diagnosis, or deciding whether I get a job, it should be making that decision for me, not for the company that built it. So we built a nonprofit, and anyone can join. It's called the Human Trust. And
sorry, but isn't it opposing to the interest of your company that gives advices of who to hire?
So the company has its own AI. That's the algorithm that's already out there. It would be nice if you similarly had something that could say, no, actually, I would be very qualified for this job, and here's all the reasons why. So we built this, and anyone who joins, and in fact, I built a company using artificial intelligence combined with epigenetics. For the first time ever, we've developed a biological test for postpartum depression. And it's predictive. So before you ever experience symptoms, our test can give an expectant mother a diagnosis, and you can begin treatment before you ever experience the symptoms. This is the single most common complication of pregnancy around the world. In the United States, it accounts for more maternal death than any other single issue.
Wow.
Is postpartum depression, and we can now predict its occurrence. So I believe that is a good thing. I also believe what I just said, that you should have a medical AI making diagnoses only in your interest. So we started the nonprofit so that it owns all of the data and it runs all of the algorithms, and its sole legal responsibility is to those moms, not to my company or anyone else.
I see.
And within that same nonprofit, we're re-releasing the Muse system for new parents.
So is it free, the Muse?
Anyone can join, and Muse is entirely free. It'll probably take us a couple of months to get it relaunched. We paused it during COVID, so I could actually focus on the postpartum depression work. But now we're releasing both of these systems for free. Everything inside the system is free, plus other groups like my company can build on top of it. They don't get to see your data. They don't get to pull it out. They can say, I've got this algorithm that can help predict postpartum depression. If you will allow us, the nonprofit runs the algorithm, not the company, and then sends to you the results, and then you can decide to share that with your doctor.
I see.
So our education work and our medical work, and we actually are looking at philanthropic work about refugees right now also. If it's about people and human development, like my whole life, this is what I'm interested in, and so this is what the Human Trust is interested in.
So just going back to, I'm interested in this muse because I'm being a mother myself,
Yeah.
you know, I know that everybody struggles, you know, like having questions if you are doing right or wrong, in addition to the education role. And so how does it work? So you feed the muse with your, like,
So
let's say,
you,
summary to your daily
whenever
life.
you
what
want
did you
to,
receive the, like, from the muse?
what you receive are activities to do with your kids. This was inspired by this amazing, actually Nobel Prize winning work done in Jamaica many years ago. Now it's like 30 years ago. This program was run for at-risk families. They had new babies at home. And in this program, once a week, social workers would come and work with the parents. And in one context, they taught them about managing their home and keeping everything clean. And in the other, they taught them little games to play with their kids for social-emotional development. They only had a limited budget. It ran for 2 years, once a week for 2 years, and then the whole program ended. And then, 20 years later, the people who ended up winning the Nobel Prize went down and studied these kids, now adults. They earned 40% more than their at-risk peers. They are dramatically less likely to be incarcerated. And these are kids coming from very difficult families and neighborhoods. And their cortisol levels are lower. So this is a hormone that's strongly related with health outcomes, particularly ischemic heart disease and cancer and so forth. So these kids that 20 years earlier played these little games with their families,
Made a difference.
earned more, were healthier, and were happier. And the simple truth is, not just kids with challenging households, we all wonder. I have 2 kids. My wife is an education researcher, and I'm a computational neuroscientist. And we felt like we didn't know what to do. If we don't feel like we know what to do, what does everyone else feel like? So I just thought, wouldn't it be amazing to have this system, and every night it would say, hey, this is not for either of us, but it was an actual message the system once sent. Hey, Maria's really interested in seahorses right now. Take 15 minutes and talk to her about seahorses. So this was from the original project that we ran that eventually led to Muse this was actually a border, Texas. So Maria, the message was actually sent in Spanish. Maria was a little girl. Her family was a migrant family. She's 5 years old, and all week long, she was talking about seahorses. And we had microphones, and our AIs were picking it up. No one else was talking about it, just her. And so our AI developed a little message, and it sent it, specifically targeted Dad. It didn't say read a book, because in these families is uncertain. Do they have books at home? Can Dad even read a book to her? But just talking to her. You mentioned endogenous motivation. How do you give a reward to a 5-year-old little girl? The reward of what you care about matters. Well, if I give her candy, or if I give her points or praise, that's an exogenous reward. It's the exact opposite of what we want. Imagine you get home that night, and like magic, your dad talks to you about seahorses. So with that original project as an inspiration, we built a system that runs as an app or just as a text messaging system. And again, it asks you questions, you answer whatever you want to, just chat with it, it learns about you, it learns about your child, your family, and then it generates activities to do.
That's very interesting. And now thinking about the other areas in which your companies have helped, you mentioned that you are also using artificial intelligence for Alzheimer's diagnosis, or what?
Yeah, so
what
in
is
this case, treatment.
treatment?
So we have this amazing young woman, a former mentee of mine, is now the CEO of the company. And she and her co-founder came up with this idea of a light, but it's a very fancy light. You can't tell, you can't perceive it, but the light is actually changing 40 times a second.
The light?
There's an actual light itself. In fact, I have one of these, and I put it under the monitor when I write in the morning. For an hour a day, it's under my monitor, I turn it on, and it's just a light, like some of the lights around here.
White light.
But what your brain, it seems like it's a white light, but it's not. It's a very fancy light, and what your brain picks up on is that this light is cycling at 40 hertz, 40 times per second. It's spinning the color wheel, an idea out of psychophysics. And again, it just seems like a white light. You could read a book by it. But in reality, it's causing activity in your brain, particularly excitingly in your parietal and frontal areas. It's causing it at 40 hertz. Cells, when you're thinking really hard, solving a math problem, involved in a deep conversation, we see this increase in 40 hertz activity in the area around it. It's called gamma activity. So we see this increase in gamma. And when you're thinking really hard, that also causes your brain, all the astrocytes and glial cells that are parts of your brain that we don't talk about that much, but they're the support structure in some ways. So when you're thinking really hard, they become very active in supplying more energy, but also in cleaning out all the stuff that's building up, all the additional gunk that builds up in your brain. Forgive me for not being terribly technical about it. and that's great. And so we should all think hard. As we get older, I'm 52 years old now, and take a different route to work every day. Learn to play a new musical instrument, learn a new language, do hard things and think about it. Mm-hmm. But for some people that are already experiencing dementia or Alzheimer's, then how can we trick their brain into thinking that it's thinking very hard? And It turns out this fancy little light does that, and it reduces.
So it crosses the skull and it gets.
So the light is going through your eyes.
Oh, I see. I see.
And so my vision right now is that eventually we'll be able to build this into tablets, like e-readers. So you can read a book for an hour and treat Alzheimer's. When we run our models in the lab, one of the brutal realities of taking science out of the lab and into the real world is it rarely works as well in the real world as it does in the lab. So we have these great results in the lab. Now our device is out in the real world and we're making measurements. And for example, one of the ways we're using artificial intelligence is these light bulbs are tracking your eyes. So we know when you're looking at the light, when you're looking away from it. So we can monitor, even at home, what in medical terms is called compliance. So we can see, wow, when people really are focused on the light, they have a better result. But if they're looking away, but if they do it longer, so we can model all of this. And AI helps us actually. It just wouldn't be possible to do this work without modern artificial intelligence.
Yeah, because I imagine that it could be really hard with the people that already has dementia, that cannot concentrate in a reading. How how can you manage to have them fixed for 1
So,
hour?
Yeah, and
looking at the
there's
light.
another device that's out there that is very clearly a strobing
Like some lens,
light.
perhaps, that you
And
can
so
put
you
on?
wear it over your head. And if you have moderate and advancing Alzheimer's, in some ways, the most aggressive treatment is the right way to go. Part of what excites me about what we're working on is not only do we see positive effects in people with mild and moderate Alzheimer's, but because we can build it, in theory, into computer screens or tablet screens, then you could use it before you have a diagnosis. Maybe you have a long family history. Maybe you have a history of major depression. My mother passed away from a stroke over the summer. And that was very hard, but one of the hardest things about it is she has what's called aphasia during the last month of her life. She couldn't speak and she couldn't understand speech. And there was nothing I could do for her. She had had a massive stroke. But it got me inspired to look in and see, can the neurostimulation that I'm talking about actually speed up language recovery in stroke victims? And again, the answer seems very clearly to be yes. And the original inspiration for me in this space was kids with traumatic brain injuries. Being able to stimulate their brains while they're engaging, and using that to give them back some of the cognitive potential that they used to have but have lost. So all of these for me are, there's a world that is right at our fingertips right now. And I have the benefit of being able to build these things, and I want to bring them out into the world. And this is a great example of a space where there is a major disease, Alzheimer's, that gets a ton of focus, as does strokes. And we have a chance to make a difference there, but also think about, well, gosh, there are so many other domains in which this could help or even prevent these in the first place.
Yes, it was what I was gonna say, because Alzheimer is like a very acute loss of memory and stuff. But everybody, as we get old, as we go beyond 50 years old, we notice that we are, our memory is not as sharp as it was before, and so on. So perhaps this stimulation will prevent the cognitive decline all along.
I think one of the big lessons of all of this is that in classic psychology, there's this idea of deep versus shallow processing. Are you thinking very hard and deeply about something or not? And I watch people on the train or wandering around, swiping in 200 milliseconds through picture after picture, text after text. And I know for a fact as a neuroscientist, it's too fast for you to have actually thought about that at all. And interestingly, some research that I've been able to put together shows, even adolescent girls on social media, which can be very scary and cause problems, the ones that stop and think and take time, just looking at the metadata, all the data on how long they're looking at the picture, every now and then they stop and think about the picture. And then write something, or they go and research it, they Google it, they look things up, and they come back. They show none of the negative effects that their peers do that are running so shallow. We need to devote ourselves to going more deeply through life. And AI can help us do that. And neurotechnologies can help us do that. But in the end, we'll only do it if we choose to do it. I can only invent these things and make them available. We need to build a generation of young people that want to explore the unknown, that are comfortable with uncertainty and choose to go deep in their lives. Because in a world where the routine will almost certainly be done by machines, I think it's wonderful to think that we have everything else. All of the unknown reality of the universe still gets to be ours.
Well, thank you very much. It has been very interesting, a fantastic opportunity to share with us your ideas, and I agree with you. So I hope that the audience also starts thinking about this, and instead of being afraid of the use of artificial intelligence, that I think that the science fiction movies can have a very profound influence, a negative influence in the use of it. But perhaps we can start inviting the people to think about it in a positive way, how we can become better persons using them wisely. Muchas gracias, Vivienne, por esta conversación. Muchas gracias a quienes nos acompañaron a esta fantástica plática. Con esto nos despedimos de este capítulo de Pensadores Contemporáneos. Hasta la próxima.